Patrick A. Reed, Associate Curator of the Marvel Universe of Superheroes exhibition, a vast and comprehensive museum show that launched in 2018 at the Museum of Pop Culture in Seattle and is currently on display at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago through October of 2021. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome you, the WonderCon at Home audience, to this program that will hopefully give a little insight on the exhibit, show some sneak peeks of some of the treasures and elements contained within, and along the way, illuminate some corners of Marvel's long and storied history. Now, your tour guides for this will be two of the core team who have brought this exhibition to life. Professor Benjamin Saunders, the Chief Curator of Marvel Universe of Superheroes and Director of the Comic Studies Program at the University of Oregon, and Brian Crosby, Creative Director of Marvel-themed entertainment. Gentlemen, welcome. I have to ask one first question, and then I'll step aside and let you get on with the conversation. Why a Marvel exhibition? Why is this a story that fits in a museum setting? What makes it important? And what were your goals in bringing this project to life?
From my perspective, I have been trying to get the work of some of our greatest comic book artists onto the walls of museums for over a decade, and have been curating shows. And when the opportunity came to do a show focused exclusively on Marvel, it was kind of a dream come true, because it was an opportunity to expand the work that I had been doing already, but to think about a larger narrative about the history of this company, to think about how we move from comics to the extraordinary transmedia empire of Marvel, and then back again to comics, how we always sort of keep comics as part of the picture, but there's this vast media world that you can try and show people a little peek behind the curtain. And then there's this cool historical narrative that goes back to the 1930s. So I wanted to try and do it all.
Doing these kinds of things is part of my job. So, when we received the proposal to do this exhibit, I mean, it was really compelling, really interesting. And so, when this proposal kind of came our way, we at Marvel Themed Entertainment, we're involved in a lot of different types of productions. We've been involved in theme parks and comic conventions and traveling shows and things like that. But we never really had a comprehensive museum exhibit that was doing what Professor Saunders and the team from SC Exhibitions were proposing to do, which is really tell the 80-year history of Marvel, not just in comics, but in all the mediums. And what's great about Marvel to me is that it's not something that we're looking back at. Certainly, there's a rich history there to mine, but Marvel is continuing to grow and expand and create new characters and new stories and develop new fans and disperse into new mediums. And so this was an opportunity to not only tell our history, but also to have it be ever evolving and changing and adding to as the Marvel universe grows. So I really thought it was a really compelling, unique, new way to present the Marvel brand.
What narrative points did you really want to convey? And were there like specific artifacts that you came across that you just knew you had to make part of this exhibition that you really needed to bring to people?
So the way that it began for me was to write a fantasy script, a kind of dream project with a beginning and a middle and an ending based on what I knew was out there in the hands of private collectors. That being a document that then you looked at, and then you had some suggestions about what you knew we could find, what we could get access to. And there was a dinner that we had quite early in the process where we had this conversation about
I do remember that dinner very well. And I remember us talking about not just what artwork we could acquire, but how many different ways we could present the Marvel story. And certainly I was blown away by the amount of original artwork that we were able to acquire, which I think is still, as a Marvel employee and as a Marvel fan, to walk in and see some of that artwork. I mean, from Marvel Comics #1, and to see like a real page, and see the line work and see it there in person is super compelling. But then talking about the photo ops and the interactives and the props and costumes we might be able to get from Marvel Studios, and You know, I mean, so often when we're working on various experiences around the world, it tends to be this is a Marvel Studios thing, this is a Marvel Comics thing, this is a Marvel Games thing, but this was Marvel. This was all of it, and it was bringing it all together, and everybody in the company was just equally jazzed and excited to be a part of it. You know, something that we hear quite a bit from Marvel creators is that Marvel is the world outside your window, and that phrase, which we hear a lot of people, a lot of creators say and talk about, we took it very literally in that dinner, and we talked about what that meant.
Oh,
And
that was for me was a really inspiring moment. We've been thinking about, if it's not the very beginning of the show, but once you hit Marvel in the 60s, you've got to begin with the Fantastic Four, and we were talking about that.
yeah,
And you kept bringing me back to, well, we want to place them in the Marvel universe. And you used that phrase, the world outside your window. And
mhm,
I suddenly thought, that's it, right? He's at home in the Baxter building, and the window is behind him. And it becomes one of the coolest interactives in the show, because you get to take your picture with Ben Grimm, but there's that window behind with the view onto Marvel's New York, and all of
yeah,
these characters going back and forth in the background. And they're literally photobombing you because you can't see that window when you take the picture, right? If you're sitting in
yeah,
it, you don't know who's there. It's a
mhm,
full 4 or 5 minute sequence that we ended up creating. And that
yeah,
all came out from you saying, really asking me, well, how are we going to integrate this into the larger Marvel universe, and how are we going to make sure that at the same time there's this moment where we get to be with the Thing in his home.
yeah. And you know, a lot of people ask me sometimes when I'm trying to get people into comics or get them started on comics, like, what do you hand somebody? What's their first book? One of the books I always hand people is Marvels. You know, illustrated beautifully by Alex Ross, and it just because it takes the regular ordinary person and puts them in the Marvel universe, and like, what would that really look like? And that it's from the real, you know, the everyman's point of view. And that's what I think that particular photo op does quite literally, is like, if you were sitting in the living room of the Fantastic Four with the Thing,
Mhm.
and you looked out your window and saw the Marvel universe, you might see
Yeah,
Spider-Man by. And that to me is what has always been what's been compelling about the Marvel universe, is that this isn't, you know, certainly we dip into fantasy worlds and things like that, but at its core, at its heart, the Marvel universe is in the here and the now, and it's today, and these things are happening. It's the extraordinary juxtaposed on the ordinary, and that photo experience captures it beautifully.
and that formula of high drama comedy and the human, it's there in the beginning, and it's there through so much of the material. So to get that in the show early seemed really important, and it was definitely something that, if you hadn't used that phrase, "world outside your window," I don't know if it would have happened at that moment.
That's super important, that we are representing the world, and people are seeing themselves in these characters, and finding new ways to either cope with their situations, or find something to aspire to be. I think that's when we're at our best. That's what we're doing.
I think of superheroes almost as, I mean, they're extraordinarily rich allegories, because on the one hand, the individual characters have their individual stories and psychologies. They are the people that we get to know. We have a very strong sense of like who we think Peter Parker is, or who we think Kamala Khan is. We feel like we know these characters, and at the same time, they're always emblematic. They've got they have ideas literally emblazoned on their chests. And they stand for things. They stand often for sometimes quite complicated things, but they are representative of ideas. They're emblematic. They're these incredibly cool-looking, visually stunning things that we can surprise people with in a show like this through sheer spectacle.
Mhm.
But they're also emblematic of psychological and social themes that we all have to, in our ordinary lives, negotiate with and live with.
And what you said there was all, that deeper level, that deeper understanding of the characters, but at the same time, they just look really cool. Like
Yeah,
Spider-Man just looks cool.
I mean, these very simple things that we forget about, that this is for a lot of people, it's the first time they have the experience of falling into a page and going down that rabbit hole and realizing, oh, there's this world of experiences that I can have just communing between me and a page. And every parent wants their child to discover that experience as a reader. And the place that I discovered it was reading Marvel Comics. And then there's this place called New York where all these characters apparently live. And it turns out that's a real place. Well, of course, you're going to want to go there.
Yeah.
I think even from the beginning of the show, we're reminding people that these are spectacular fantasies that are tethered to our lives in all kinds of ways, geographically as well as psychologically.
Yeah, the relationship between the fans and the creators is as equally important, especially the way Stan engaged the fans through his soapbox. But I think one thing for me as an aspiring creator as a kid, as inspired as I was by the exploits of the X-Men and Spider-Man, I was as captivated by the personalities that I was reading about, which at the time was people like Todd McFarlane and Jim Lee. But then looking back and going, oh my gosh, Jack Kirby and Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, and who were all these people? And they did this for a living. And that amazing roster of creators that have come since. I'm honored and humbled to be one of the torchbearers, for Marvel. I love it.
Well, what you just kind of put your arms around there really is, I think, a big feature of the show. I think it's one of the reasons that so many of the audience members are moved by the experience of the original art. I mean, seeing the costumes and getting into cool interactives, that stuff is awesome. But there is something about the simplicity of recognizing this isn't a reproduction. This is the hand-drawn page from which the comics were shot. You can see the paste ups and the whiteout and the erasing marks and the little editorial notes and the zipper tone and all that cool stuff. And you become very aware of it as a made thing, as something that, somebody sitting by themselves at a drawing board with a pencil and a brush was putting themselves into this work and then somehow creating fantasies that now have got into all of our imaginations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the beauties of the show is thinking of all the things, the time and effort that we put into it it's a true labor of love. It's the things that speak to us as creators and curators, and then to think that we might be able to maybe touch the heart of some child that's going to come in there that loves these characters because they saw them in a video game or a movie or a TV show or a comic book, but they're going to be inspired by somebody that did that thing for real, that and that they could become the next creator and create the next Spider-Man or tell the next Spider-Man tale. For me, I mean, once I cracked open that first comic book and saw that this was something people could do for a living, that became my sole objective. I wanted to be a comic book artist. I did some independent comic book work. My career really took off when I got an internship at Walt Disney Imagineering. And so for 10 years, I was a concept designer at Walt Disney Imagineering, which is responsible for the design and delivery of the Disney theme parks around the world. And I had the opportunity to work on a variety of IP, from Tron to Star Wars, Alice in Wonderland, Pirates of the Caribbean, a big variety. But I think I really found my niche when I started working with the folks from Marvel. Joe Quesada, the chief creative officer at the time, he and I just became great friends, as because I was passionate about Marvel and also telling theme park stories, and marrying those two ideas. We developed a great friendship, and that turned into the job that I have today, overseeing themed entertainment at Marvel. And so I've been doing that for about 5 years. And so anytime I go into an experience like this, like an exhibit or anything, frankly, I do hearken back to my passion and knowledge of storytelling in the comic book medium, but also that in the theme park space. If you think about a theme park experience or an attraction, you are no longer just designing a story or a movie in which somebody is going to passively sit and watch action unfold on a screen or in a comic book. That person is now going to be moved physically moved in some way through a narrative. And so everything I work on now, I do approach in that same way, whether it's a museum exhibit or even a Comic Con. And in a sense, when somebody goes into an experience like this, they become the protagonist of the narrative, because now everything is happening to you. As far as you're concerned, the whole world revolves around you, and you're seeing everything and you're taking the pictures that you want to take. It's all about you. And so you're no longer just watching action unfold. You are a part of the action. And that's a very different way of thinking about storytelling, at least from a Marvel perspective, right? Because now we're having to incorporate the guest into that narrative. And I love that challenge. And so, as we look at this exhibit, this show, this experience, we're moving people through a space and telling them a narrative, an 80-year narrative, and allowing them to touch, see, smell, observe, and be a part of the Marvel universe. Because I do think we want to not just be on screens all day, but we want to be in spaces interacting with other people, like-minded people that are passionate about the same things we're passionate about, and getting to be in stories, especially being stories that we love.
I think that if this last year has taught us anything, it is the truth of that the idea that we can make education happen, or that we can make up for huge distances between us and still have some sort of screen-based intimacy. We are social creatures. We need one another. My experience is oddly similar to yours, despite the differentness of our career paths. Brian, I started out wanting to draw as well. I mean, these comics, when I first encountered them, they didn't just make me want to read; they made me want to draw. And I spent a lot of time. My desire up until about the age of 17 or 18 was to draw comics. When you talk about the importance of narrative and of conveying experience through narrative, that theme park narrative, I think that is the way. There is no more powerful way of conveying information than through a story. I think what we've done in the show is in some ways not just create that through line, that larger chronology, but we've also created stories within the stories for fans who there's a sort of a 1939 to now larger chronological arc that you kind of move through. But then within it, there's an opportunity to do a deep dive at a media table here or there. If you really want to know the history of the Black Panther, not just his comic book origin, but the story behind the actual creation of the character, and then what the character looks like now. We have these illustrated mini essays, is what they are. And because of the infinite space that is created by a digital touchscreen, you could spend an hour or two looking at these cool pictures and getting a little bit of information about decade by decade on that one character. But if you want to stick with that larger narrative and not go, that's always there for you to kind of jump back on, So if you're there as a family and you don't really have time to stop and look at everything, well, there's something that's going to, there's the main part of the ride that will just take you through the whole thing in about an hour or so. We tried to put those things in. We tried to create those diverging parts of story, whether it's the peek behind the curtain to see how comics get made, whether it's some of those dramatic moments of transmedia success that come before the modern Marvel universe, things like the 1960s cartoons or the 1990s X-Men cartoon or the Incredible Hulk TV show of the 1970s. There are you've got places to stop and take all of that in. And I think it all depends really on your the amount of time you have and your bandwidth for Marvel. Museums have been smart in the way that they have adapted to this, the COVID crisis. Now we have situations where, styluses instead of touch screens. You can control the number of people who go through a show at any one time to minimize risk and so on. And it also actually gave us an opportunity to take a beat and think about redesigns for the show, to think about things that we might actually, in an unexpected way, have a bit more time to redesign elements in the wake of the the reaction that the public had already had to the show.
We also wanted to be aware of the fact that the Marvel Universe continues on. We still have had comic books coming out. We've seen a hunger for content in a completely new way. You know, people are dying for the Black Widow film to come out, and we've seen things like WandaVision, and it's an exciting time for the Marvel Universe. And so we wanted to make sure that our exhibit was also growing and evolving. And so we've been able to start to dip into the characters like the Champions, kind of the which is essentially a youth movement in the Marvel Universe. So now you can pose alongside Kamala Khan and learn more about those characters. You can learn more about Shang-Chi. So I mean, it's an exciting time for Marvel for sure, in that we are growing, and we wanted to make sure that we were representing that evolution, that growth in the exhibit itself. I mean, even different mediums, looking at Marvel games and the way, video games are being, are a whole new way of telling Marvel stories, and a whole new generation is learning from games like Spider-Man and Avengers and Contest of Champions and Future Fight. And so we wanted to make sure that we were capturing some of that as well, because people are learning about the Marvel characters through those new mediums. So that's part of the fun in working on this behind the scenes, and working with Professor Saunders and his team and the SC Exhibitions team, is we're all passionate and we're all fans, and we all want to see how we can do things new and different and keep growing.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how even as you were saying, I was thinking about how the ending of the show changed. When we first designed it, part of my thought was, one of the things I hope people will feel after seeing this show is they'll think, man, I want to go read a Marvel comic. And so we created this space at the end of the show where it was like a big comfy reading room, big chairs, and we had stacks of comics lying around the room so that you could stop and read some books. And for the first week or so, it worked great. And then I went up to see the show after about a month, and all the comics were gone because we hadn't, bolted them down, and everyone just left with them. It's like, it worked too well. People didn't, people wanted to read the comics so badly at the end of the show that they just took them with them. So we changed the ending a little, and we have a more expanded view now of the Marvel cosmos. Sort of thinking about, it seemed like a natural place to end the show would be to think about the Marvel universe expanding out into multiple universes. And to a nice degree, I think we even anticipated where the narrative of the MCU is now going into the multiverse. So some of the material that wasn't there at the very beginning, if someone is coming back to see it, we have, for example, a couple of really nice originals by John Romita Jr. from the Eternals series. That's another movie that I know people are anticipating. So yeah, there's definitely stuff that people who saw the show in Seattle or in Philadelphia would be surprised to see in the latest version.
Well, in the same way that you go every Wednesday and pick up your new comics, or you keep turning out for the next Marvel movie, it's like it's an ongoing saga. And I think this exhibit is that in the same way. It's the Marvel universe in a microcosm. Is that every time we go to a new destination, there's going to be some new elements that you haven't seen before.
Same from the point of view of the history, right? I mean, when we think about when you become a serious fan, as I see happening sometimes to some of my students now, and as I know happened to me, there's a desire to not just consume the latest product, but you get really curious about, okay, so wait a second, this Master of Kung Fu book in the 70s, where can I find those back issues? I want to read those. Or even what for us might feel like recent history, but for newer fans is now the past. And part of our job, I think, in the show is to realize that history itself is organic. Our sense of what matters from the history of Marvel changes depending on where Marvel is at right now. And so these properties from the 70s that it might have been neglected. In some cases, there wasn't a Shang-Chi book for quite a while. Now, one of the, most significant comic book writers in the industry, Jin Luen Yang, is now writing Shang-Chi. So we want to be able to.
It's almost like there's a plan. It's almost like there's a plan to get people excited about comics and movies.
Yeah, exactly. But I like what we get to do is then say, oh, you like that? Well, here's how it looked in 1974. Here's how it looked in 1986. You know, here's how it looked in 1992. And if you've got a favorite character, you can then, you know, it's people love arguing about this stuff, right? The greatest, whose version of Spider-Man is the definitive version. You know, this is one of the things actually that the show raises as questions in, I think, an entirely friendly way. You know, we have this, thousands of people have drawn the Amazing Spider-Man over the years, and everyone has a favorite. And then there are a handful of people you could say, yeah, but who changed, who defined the character for a whole generation? Who are the artists who actually put their stamp on this so successfully that they become the house look, the brand for a whole decade or more, right? And then can we show people that? So, you know, we have Steve Ditko, John Romita Sr., Mark Bagley, Todd McFarlane, represented as artists who not only did great work on these characters, but redefined those characters for the individual generations for whom they worked. You know, I mean, for you, Spider-Man is Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man at some really fundamental level. For me, it's probably Romita Senior's, because that was the first time that was what I saw, right? For a current generation, it might be Humberto Ramos. For, you know, that's those artists are going to redefine that character for a new generation of readers. And we get to trace those lines. We get to make those connections over decades of history, and then present that to people in a way that I think makes a different kind of fan, actually, makes a different kind of enthusiast out of you.
This is why I was so excited to be on this panel at WonderCon at home with Professor Saunders, because I mean, we couldn't have imagined a better Marvel missionary than Professor Saunders.
It's not as if I have to work terribly hard to get people excited about this material. That is the honest truth. But it is an exciting thing for just as you said, you know, when you yourself realize, oh, wait a minute, this is a job. People make these things. Yeah. People, there are a group of people who are creating these things. Part of what you get to do in a more academic setting and in the environment, in the narrative of a museum show, is to give people that little bit of a peek behind the curtain and let them see where some of this stuff comes from, and let them see it evolve over historical periods of time. It doesn't just excite new readers. It becomes a place where now people can bond intergenerationally. You know, if your kids have different favorite Marvel superheroes from your own, or different favorite creators from your own, that's just a conversation that you could be having. You know, that's just it's like, you know, you think that's good. You want to read some of this. You know, it's a I think people really enjoy debating over, you know, their favorite pop cultural phenomena. And here is an opportunity to add some real detail and knowledge to that debate.
Thank you both so much. And I'm afraid we're just about out of time, but I really appreciate you being here and taking the time to join us, and to, as someone who works on the exhibition, also to get to sit back and listen to you guys cooking up more things is really, really thrilling. So thanks so much. And thanks to the WonderCon at Home audience.